Peter doesn't know what will happen next when he goes to the Sea of Tiberias to go fishing. He may have been filled with a combination of feeling some relief as well as grief by getting back to his old routine. He might have been thinking to himself, well, Jesus is alive in some strange way. And he doesn't seem to be angry with me, but that relationship seems to be dead. What else can I do but go back to what I know and to go back to who I used to be? We who follow Jesus these thousands of years later know that God surprises us. And that's exactly what Jesus does and says when he encounters Peter and the disciples again. It's a fish story of sorts this morning. And while I'm an occasional angler, it's not a passionate pastime of mine. But this fish story in John's gospel today is different than anyone I've ever heard or told, if I'm honest. Sure, it says that they caught a whole lot of fish, and large ones at that. But no one says how long they were. No one says how much they weighed. No one judges fish and fishermen like they do on one of my guilty pleasure TV shows called Wicked Tuna, where bluefin are caught off of the coast of New England, and the fisher and the fish are valued by how much they will bring per pound as they're packed in ice and sent as a delicacy to Asia. No, the fish story that you and I hear today is that they caught exactly 153 fish. Now, don't get me wrong, 153 fish is a whole lot of fish. But I've always wondered about this fish story, why it shares that particular detail with us. And like the pastor and church geek that I am, I've spent some time with my library and online reading scholars and Bible commentators. And Jerome, one of the church fathers, said in one of his writings that 153 was all of the fish of the world. At the time, maybe? I don't know. What does this number mean? And as I've pondered this, I keep going back to the specificity of the number. And I wonder, why did the keeper of this fish story just not say it was a whole lot of fish? But for me, I think it's a way for us to see God present in the midst of the disciples' grief and questioning, as they're trying to get back into the normalcy of a routine, whatever that might have looked like following Jesus' death. I see it as a way for the disciples to encounter and see Jesus in the flesh for the third time, we're told. And I see it as a way for them to live into being Easter people, receiving the abundance of God when all they could sense was scarcity, being filled with the hope of God when all they felt was despair, and experiencing the restoration of relationship with God when all they could perceive was being abandoned. In this fish story, the details remembered are not exaggerated. The details remembered are the promise of life and life abundant. Life abundant that we see in all of those fish. Life abundant we see in encountering the risen Lord, and life abundant in receiving reconnection and a resurrection of hope and relationship with Jesus, the one who meets us wherever we are. While this Gospel of John is all about abundant grace, and way back in the first chapter in verse 16, it talks about grace upon grace. The word isn't mentioned again. And perhaps it's because John points to the very presence of grace in other ways, in and through Jesus, in and through incarnation, through tangible things like 153 fish. And while you and I might not always think of grace as something tangible, one can be invited to tangible grace, as Thomas was last week, to see and touch hands and side. And I'm sure those 153 fish were a sight and smell to behold. That's tangible. And then when Jesus asks for some of them to be cooked, and he serves the disciples breakfast, they become the means of grace to taste and see that the Lord is good. And this passage has made people who do my role in the world wonder, is this the Sunday we should serve fish with the bread and the wine? It's a fish story that's all about tangible truth, because God's grace upon grace is tangible for all of us. It appears in the abundance of caught and grilled fish. And it's not limited to the incarnation, or to the crucifixion, or to the tomb, or to the resurrection. It's certainly not limited to the end of a fish story or the gospel called John. Resurrection is amazing, grace-filled abundance. And it might be sometimes beyond our imagination, or beyond our calculation, or beyond our scriptural understanding of 153 fish. And this is because in Scripture we're told that there are also many other things that Jesus did. And if every one of them were written down, the world itself could not contain all of those books. Beloveds, we who live as Easter people, between womb and tomb, knowing and experiencing this grace upon grace and the tangible truth of resurrection, we can always expect God to surprise us. We can expect it by Jesus showing up at every daybreak in our lives. We can expect it by Jesus restoring us to relationship with Him, no matter how many times we deny, no matter how much we doubt, no matter how often we run away fishing or golfing or shopping or just pulling the covers up over our heads on a Sunday morning. Jesus invites us over and over again to share in a meal where we are comforted, where we are fed, where we are forgiven, and where we are empowered, whether it be at a beach breakfast or at the Holy Communion we share each week. Fed and forgiven, the unconditional love of Jesus the Christ calls out to each one of us and commissions each of us to follow and to care for God's people and God's creation. Because, beloveds, we are Peter, and Peter is us. Our second chances don't come from some penitential act or some good work that you and I do to earn God's grace upon grace. Instead, for Peter, the one that denied him 3 times, and for you and me who deny him a whole lot more, they come from that amazing abundance of God, the never-ending second chances given in the promised love and the promised presence of Jesus, the one who returns again and again to each one of you. Beloveds, the good news this day is that Jesus knows where you live. Jesus stands on all of the shores of your lives. And Jesus knocks on all of the closed doors and walls that you put up. And when you finally answer him, he just has 2 questions. Do you love me? And if so, what are you going to do about it? Jesus, of course, hopes that you answer by following him, by feeding his lambs and tending and feeding his sheep. And if you listen really closely, You can hear him knocking for you right now.